Hello everybody. Sorry for the delay or the absence, but I'm back. I may be having surgery on Friday, so I guess we'll just see how that ends up. Until then, I have decided to make some meatball sliders for dinner. I'll show you what inspired me. I got these little ciabatta rolls. I thought they were bigger, more like a standard size, because I was gonna make a rib sandwich out of them, but I ended up getting these little guys, so I decided to make little meatball sandwiches with them. So let's get started on the meatballs. I have a pretty standard recipe that I follow, and the nice part is that you can then turn this meatball into pretty much anything else. So if you want to make Italian meatballs, if you want to make like a buffalo chicken style meatball. I also have a recipe for Asian meatballs that are really, really good. That's actually where this meatball base came from. So that's kind of what started all of this. So I'm going to start with 2 pounds total of meat, which for this is, I'm using 1 pound of Italian pork sausage and 1 pound of ground beef. To that, I'm also going to add some onion. Normally for meatballs, I do also like to add spinach to them because it's a nice way to hide vegetables without nobody actually knowing that they're in there. But unfortunately, I did not think that far ahead today to thaw out some spinach, and I don't have any fresh. So we're just gonna go without. Now, if I'm gonna put onions in something like this, I do try to make sure that they are super, super small and fine. Because especially since these are gonna be a smaller meatball, nobody's gonna want a big chunk of onion in their sandwich. So I'm just gonna run this through one more time, make sure I don't have any big pieces. I did also try to find a recipe for a homemade tomato sauce, and for some reason homemade tomato sauces are real intimidating for me, and I don't know why. So I decided that I do have a jar of spaghetti sauce in the cabinet, so I'm going to use that for now. So spaghetti sauce from scratch is for a different day. So I'm going to add a little bit of chopped onion. That was a half of this little guy, so it was probably less than a quarter of a cup. And then I added maybe a tablespoon of garlic. And I'm going to add 1 cup of breadcrumbs. You can use plain, you can use Italian, you can use panko if you like. Whatever kind of breadcrumbs you prefer, you can put in this. I'm using Italian because that's what I have, and that's coincidentally what we're making. I am also going to add some Italian seasoning. Probably about a teaspoon or 2, because I do want these to have some flavor on their own. And then a little bit of salt, pepper, garlic. Same thing, that's probably about 1 teaspoon. And then I'm also going to add some fresh Parmesan. You can either use fresh grated, or if you have the cheese that comes in the can, the grated stuff, that's fine too. I like the fresh stuff just because then it makes my meatballs kind of cheesy. But it does also act as a binder for your meatballs to help stick them together. This is probably going to be a few tablespoons. Unfortunately, I don't really measure for these anymore, but I will post a recipe that has actual measurements in it for you. These are really foolproof. You really can't mess them up. The only time it does get a little tricky is if you do add stuff like spinach or mushrooms. Usually the onions don't give you too much trouble, but anything that has extra moisture in it, like spinach or mushrooms, that kind of thing that hold on to moisture, can be a little problematic and make your meatballs wet. So just a note for that. I am wearing gloves for this because I am a little prissy and I do not like to get ground meat underneath my fingernails. Other than that, I have no real reason for wearing gloves. It's just a personal preference thing. I am going to also add 2 eggs to this. I have deck eggs. I have one that's very large and one that's kind of small. This recipe calls for 2 large eggs. Oh, you know what? I thought that was gonna happen. So that huge duck egg ended up being one that has 2 yolks in it. So I think I'm just gonna go ahead and use that 1 egg. And I think it's gonna be just fine. So now I'm gonna squish all this together. This is another reason I like to use my hands, is I do feel like it does incorporate everything a little bit better. But that might just be me. Maybe I'm crazy. Another thing for meatballs is if you don't want to use a sausage or a flavored pork, you can always just use regular ground pork. You could use ground veal. You can use ground turkey, ground chicken. You can really substitute any meat you want for this. That's kind of why I like doing this recipe that calls for 2 pounds of meat, because that gives me the opportunity to use one meat that's maybe a little fattier, like the pork, and then maybe a meat that's a little bit on the leaner side, like ground chicken or ground turkey. All right, this is just about done. I had some breadcrumb at the bottom that I wanted to make sure I got in there. Same thing, if you don't want to add onion, you don't have to. I am guilty. I put onions in everything. Onions and mushrooms. Almost always in everything. Okay, so we have our meat all mixed up. Now we're going to put it on our tray for baking. You can use any size scoop or your hands or a spoon or anything you want. I decided to use a scoop because I want them to be uniform. What I'm also going to do is I'm going to use this bigger scoop. So it is going to give me a bigger size meatball, but the trick is, once these are baked, I'm going to cut these meatballs in half so that they sit on the sandwich nicely. And I'll show you guys what I mean by that after I take these out of the oven and let them rest. If I were to put these round meatballs, even if they were a smaller size, on those little tiny buns, you would bite into them and they're gonna squeeze out or roll out. You're gonna have a hard time getting a grip on them. So by cutting them in half and giving them a flat side, that's going to make them stay in your sandwich and make them easier to eat. I was going to make a meatball sub kind of dinner. That's why I had this meat out. But like I said, I accidentally got these smaller rolls, smaller buns. I got a grocery delivery and that was what I got. So I'm so thankful for grocery delivery. Makes my life super easy. And behind me, I do have the oven on and preheated to 400. These will maybe take a little longer than my usual meatball recipe. The usual meatball recipe calls for, I think, 10 to 12 minutes. So I will probably still set a timer for 10 to 12 minutes and just check them. And if they're not done all the way, then obviously I'll add time and just kind of go from there. I'm not really trying to make these beautiful. Like I said, I am gonna cut them in half, but I'm just trying to smooth out those little loose edges that I get from using the scooper. And I wanna make sure that they're packed nice and tight. Super excited to try out my stoneware pan because I love these so much. They do keep your food hot for a long time, so if you were gonna serve off of this, like if you made nachos or something, it's gonna keep them nice and warm. Plus, it is a little bit chillier here today in Indiana, so any excuse for me to have my oven on is a good excuse. Okay, we are going to put these in the oven for, like I said, 10 to 12 minutes. I will adjust this recipe if it does end up being longer than that. For these bigger meatballs, I'll adjust the actual recipe that I post for you guys so you'll know for sure how long they actually take. Okay, see you guys back in a bit.